If everybody's ready, we will. I'll call today's hearing to order. I have a couple of introductory remarks through which I hope to kind of focus the committee's attention on what the purpose of this hearing is. And then I'll ask if other members have comments they'd like to make, and then we will go to the state treasurer and the legislative analyst, whose testimony I am very anxious to hear, because I think we need some ideas and some assistance in going forward here, because I think this. I was at a meeting last night, in fact, and talking a little bit about my history here, my very short history here, and I realized I've been I was born and raised in California. I've lived here all my life, 54 years, and I said, and I believe this is California's greatest hour of need. I've never seen any time like this, and I've only been in the Capitol for 5 years, but I've gotten an unfortunately pretty good grasp of how dire the circumstances are, and I think the two gentlemen that are going to talk to us today have an even better grasp of that. But to me, this is California's hour of need, and we need to know how can we move us forward as a state and as a community. So the purpose of the hearing today is to talk about ideas and recommendations made by the State Treasurer's Office in the 2009 Debt Affordability Report and the LAO's October memo on debt service costs. And I just want to say at the outset, these are seminal reports, I think. These are very, very important reports that summarize the situation that we're in and start to give us some recommendations to go forward. And in my opinion, they're two of the most important reports that I've read in my short time in office. In November, the LAO projected that debt service costs would increase to 9% of the total general fund budget by 2014-2015. This debt service will be the fastest growing expenditure area in our budget over the next 5 years, growing at 8.4% per year. And we need to start figuring out how much borrowing we can really realistically, sustainably afford, and how we handle the legacy of these debt costs that we've already incurred. Our infrastructure was built to serve 25 million people, and we have many, many needs. We have historically met these needs on a first-come, first-served finance model. We keep identifying projects and piling the borrowing costs for them on top of each other, and the result is a mountain of $62 billion in bonds that have been issued and $49.5 billion in approved bonds that will someday hit the street. Consider the package that was passed by the legislature this year, which I was a vocal critic of and did not support. It relies on over $11 billion in general obligation bonds, which will cost California's general fund some $700 million a year for debt service. And the question has to be asked, how do we pay for that? We've just added to this ongoing growing pile. And in my opinion, this is not sustainable. In 2006, the governor proposed a strategic growth plan that included $235 billion in infrastructure projects to be completed over 20 years. Now, it's undeniable that California has backed away from investing in its infrastructure. Roads, highways, environmental restoration projects, schools and universities have gone neglected for decades. Some of these projects that were in the governor's proposal were in bond packages that we've issued, but many of them are still unfunded and real deficiencies that we will have to fix at some point in the future. And again, I have to ask, how do we pay for this? We're really talking today, I think, about how we go forward and invest in California's future. In his report, the state treasurer urges California to adopt a future master plan for infrastructure financing and development, and I hope to use that report as a thoughtful debt planning priority through our budget discussions over the next year. And I think that debt is going to be a big part of those discussions as we go forward. I'm hoping that today we can start to make the case and maybe even create a little outline for establishing at least a mechanism to guide us on how and when to sell our bond debt, and for which infrastructure investment priorities, how we set those priorities, and what the legislature's role is in setting those priorities. We also need to start talking about how much total debt California should and can realistically issue, and how we meet our infrastructure needs within that amount. The State Treasurer's report recommends the creation of a commission that would conduct a public assessment of the state's infrastructure needs, costs, and financing alternatives, and to create a blueprint and a timetable. And I'd like us to specifically discuss that recommendation and how we go forward in fleshing that out. and as I said, what the legislature's role would be. So we're fortunate to be joined today by the two gentlemen that have issued these reports, State Treasurer Bill Lockyer and Legislative Analyst Mac Taylor. And before I go to your testimony, I would first like to ask the other members if you have any opening comments you'd like to make. Mr. Swanson?
And clarify for the people of California the need that exists for infrastructure improvements. These bonds then serve as an investment in our state, one that we argue we can't avoid. So if we can't avoid it, then we should also agree for ways to pay for it. And I think that that requires a very sobering discussion, a very realistic assessment, and some explanation to the people of California that if this is going to be a state that that's going to survive and reflect our priorities, then we have to invest in the state. During this severe recession, it's clear that investment in infrastructure will also lead to a number of jobs. And so it's probably one of the few ways California can invest in itself by putting its people back to work. And so there's a lot of positives associated with this, but we can't continue to avoid figuring out how to pay for it. And I think that requires straight talk, and both of you gentlemen have a reputation of straight talk, so I look forward to your presentation today.
Very true. We do expect to hear some straight talk. Mr. Silva.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. In November of 1994, I ran for the Orange County Board of Supervisors. I was elected. I felt very good about that. I received a phone call December 6th, and one of the supervisors called and he said, Jim, we're going into closed session and it looks like we're going to be declaring bankruptcy. So I'm waiting for the punchline that never came. It was just dial tone. Well, the Board of Supervisors went into closed session, they declared bankruptcy, and immediately my phone lit up like a Christmas tree, and the press wanted to know my first thoughts when I found out Orange County was in bankruptcy. And I have to be honest with you, my first thought was I'd like a recount. It was absolutely horrible, and we ended up cutting back about 22% of our workforce in Orange County. In 18 months, we were able to get out of it without a tax increase. The voters said we do not want a tax increase, but we were able to do it because we had workers in Orange County that really made up the difference. The average person in Orange County did not even realize we were in bankruptcy. University of California at Irvine did a survey, and less than 15% of the people in Orange County actually felt the bankruptcy. The problem is the 15% that felt the bankruptcy were the bottom 15 of our income scale. And when I first arrived in Sacramento, and I'm too a lifetime resident of California, I was amazed at the way the budget process went through, because I've never felt in working on the budget that we have priorities. And I look at California as having 5 major priorities that are right at the top. Number 1 is public safety. I'm a school teacher. I taught for 28 years, and people say, well, how can you put public safety in front of education? Well, if a neighborhood is not safe for a child to go to school and return home safely, I don't care how great that teacher is or how great that school is, the system is not going to work. But I believe in public safety, education, health, transportation, and in the state of California, water. And I know that in 1985, when the state of California...
That's probably 98% of the budget you just mentioned in terms of priorities.
I realize that. But I also realize that there's some programs in there, Mr. Treasurer, that I don't think should be funded if we can't fund the other 5. But
Understood.
when the state of California, the state legislature, changed the graduation requirements and took out what we called at that time vocational education programs in the state of California, now we have people saying, well, why is there such a large dropout rate? Well, as a teacher, I'd rather have a youngster in my classroom than on some street corner. And when we cut out those programs, we lost an awful lot of kids because not every kid has the ability to go to college, and not everybody has the interest to go to college. And I think that we need what we're instituting now in California are career programs. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. All excellent points. And I did want to point out, too, you just reminded me this, the city of Vallejo, which I represent, is currently in bankruptcy. And one of the things I often tell community groups is if the state goes down fiscally, every entity in the state goes down as well. But here's another example of a local entity going bankrupt ahead of the state. And then the other thing I wanted to point out is just to give an example of why this concerns me so deeply. Last week, the governor cut the funding for the Every Woman Counts program, $16 million, which is, a drop in the bucket as far as our entire general fund is concerned. But over 100,000 women every year will not get breast cancer screening. That condemns potentially to death about 1,000 women a year in the state of California. And when we're talking about a $16 million program versus the billions and billions of dollars that we're talking about in debt service, that's where it really hits home. We're talking about real lives. And it's extremely important to me, and I think everybody in this room, that we get a handle on where our debt service is going in the state and how we can fund it so that we don't have to be doing things like cutting breast cancer screening for the poor women of the state. So that's why we called this budget hearing, and I would appreciate it, Mr. Lockyer, if you could start us off.
Sure. Thank you very much, and thanks for the chance to begin this dialogue. I'm delighted to be here with the analyst because we collaborate in a lot of ways with respect to these matters. I think that I can respond best to your questions you posed, Madam Chair, by showing you this pictorially. So we have some slides, and let's just start with those. First, a question was asked of the various executive branch entities and how do they fit into this stream of bond financing. And most of the heavy lifting is really the Department of Finance. I think we've provided these for you as well if you'd rather look at the pieces of paper. But they prioritize among the various bond acts. We'll chat with them about some of the things that we think they're omitting or under financing, but essentially they make those choices and in what bond money will go to which department and that sort of thing. Then we prepare and market the bonds and a variety of legal tasks associated with that, and to see that the tax laws are respected and so on. The various departments administer Caltrans, their road bond money or whatever, and the state controller's office tracks the expenditures and accounting of the matters. Obviously, this is the executive branch side. With respect to the legislature's responsibilities, both in terms of setting appropriation limits or amounts, the legislature very frequently is involved in actually determining which bonds are going to get sold or used, and then oversight potential responsibilities as well. The next chart compares us and our bond ratings. They have these essentially ABC taxonomy of bonds, and we have different kinds, different flavors of debt on the left, but essentially what this tells you is that unless there is a discrete revenue stream attached to bond repayment, we drop down the ladder into B categories. And then when you look at us compared to the other big states, we're the lowest of those states. They're all A rated in various ways. We're B. We're actually the bottom of the 50 states. So Louisiana used to be below us. They've now beat us. We're the bottom of 50. Now, I complain a lot about whether that's fair or not, but it's just a market reality whether it happens to be fair or not. The next chart tries to show how much that costs us. What does it mean to taxpayers, in effect, when we have that low credit rating? And so there's various indices that are available, and what this essentially does is compare what would investors be getting for their investments in AAA, high, the highest sort of ranking of bonds compared to ours. And essentially, and it shows over time how those curves escalate upward. And basically for 30-year bonds, we're paying 1.72% higher than the AAA market. So almost 2% more, although that quarter is a lot. So 1.2% more than we might if we had a substantially better credit rating. And comparing that to, say, 10 years ago, the difference for California was 31 basis points. You know, 1%, basis point is 1/100th of a percent, and so there's 100 of them in 1%. We were paying 0.31% more interest a decade ago than we are today. The next slide basically indicates how much, what is that in dollar amounts. So for every $1 billion of bond we sell, these 30-year bonds, it's an extra $380 million interest that we'll pay over the life of that bond compared to the higher rated bond. So $380 million for every billion that we issue. Now we've got about, as you'd mentioned earlier, about $47.5 billion of bonds that have been authorized by voters, but we haven't sold them yet. And if we went to the market, or could go to the market, and current rating and interest rates and so on, that's an additional $18 billion that we would be paying over the life of those bonds that have been authorized but not issued. I wanted to show you, so 21%, show you how we compare to other national issuers. We are often, you know, comments are made about we're the 8th largest economy on the planet, and, you know, things of that nature. And the next chart shows you how, compared to various other countries that you would think are not as economically vibrant as us, how much more we're paying for debt. So the spread of 310, these are taxable bonds, so it's a little bit, it's not the interest-free bonds that we were talking about earlier, but compared to, you know, Indonesia, the Philippines, and so on, we're paying substantially more than third world countries. I guess I can call those third world. Emerging markets are paying for their debt. The rating agencies tend to be very critical of California, but one of the things that they approve of is our portfolio is pretty conservative. So it's largely fixed income, about 94%. Are fixed income issues rather than variable debt. Variable debt, sometimes you can make a good deal, and sometimes, like in the last 2 years, it just bites you, and it's very expensive. So anyhow, it's one of the things that that we get good marks for of having that sort of portfolio. Otherwise, I suppose our ratings would even be more impaired. It looked like the Assemblyman was going to say something. Yeah.
Question. When California meets with the rating agencies, who represents California? Do you?
Me, the governor's office, LAO is sometimes involved in those, finance. There's a group of financial folks that talk with, and the controller. They rely, I think, principally on the Department of Finance and our office, but everyone kind of pulls an oar. And sometimes they're just telephone conferences, and other times they're long sit-down sessions.
Do we ever take a group back to New York and...
Oh, yeah. And, they snicker. But anyhow, we do that, yes.
Those vultures? Yes.
Yeah, right. The next chart tries now to get to the amount of debt service and what proportion of the state budget does it represent. And you'd mentioned this, Madam Chair, a little earlier. The first chart is just paying off the bonds we've already sold. So it doesn't add into it the unissued, the water bond, et cetera, the prison construction, et cetera, things that we quite likely will have added to the shelf in the ensuing years. So you get to be $10.5 billion in 2020. Wait, pardon me. Let me go back. So it's $7.5 billion where that yellow blip occurs, where we're repaying the forced borrowing on counties from Prop 1A. Not a particularly good way to have done it, by the way, but since it can only be done once, I guess it's not worth re-debating. But again, there is that peak where we're obligated to make those repayments. And then we add in the next chart these other categories that haven't yet been issued, water bonds and so on. And you'll see where that takes us to $10.5 billion in 2020 in debt service in the general fund. And it really stays above $10 billion for the foreseeable future. Now, this assumes that future legislatures are not going to add to University State College, K-14, whatever else, highways. The high-speed rail is in the category of the unsold 47, but I don't think it's enough to pay for it. So anyhow, there's a whole lot of maybes that aren't yet contemplated by this list. Then we have what percent of the general fund is that? And you see that it peaks with the current plan at just under 11%, 10.98% in 3 years. And that, if it didn't have some of the other, if you exclude repayment of Prop 1A and so on, it looks like a smaller number, but the truth is it's a debt we're obligated to pay. So I don't know that it is much more than a talking point to exclude it. It's something we have to pay for. So 11%. 11% of the general fund going for debt, I think everybody thinks is too high. Now, because of the revenue fall, the denominator is shrunk, which makes anything that's a numerator on top of that equation a bigger percentage, but we don't anticipate any cascading new revenues that are going to make the base number a lot larger, that'll make the percentage smaller. So anyhow, and then the next chart simply indicates how much we've been relying on debt since 10 years ago, basically. Debt service has risen 138% compared to general fund growth of revenues of 24%. So you can see how much we're increasingly relying on debt for very frequently necessary investments that people demanded, that we understand. Next chart, I'm almost through them, simply shows what happened this last year, and it is pretty extraordinary. Maybe look at the right. First, it has what different kinds of bonds we did this last year, $36 billion. And then the smaller little charts show First, we are the largest issuer in the country, corporate or public entity, by a substantial amount. Usually the corporate issuers are much larger than municipal, and so we have that distinction, if that's what it should be called. And then, of course, when you look at what other states are doing, New York is normally the second largest issuer, and we wind up being, like 2.5 times what they're doing. Now, much of this was the one-time short-term financing because of the IOUs that had to be repaid and short-term debt management issues. But it's a lot of money, and it's getting harder and harder to go to capital markets to access this kind of money. Number 12 basically breaks down how the bond money was used from this last year. And I should mention at this point sort of one of the mechanisms that you and others heard a lot about, generally for the first time last year, pooled money investment account. It used to be we would have basically surplus monies, and we would use those to pay the cash flow needs of the state. It's like a big funnel where the money goes. And we would also advance money, loan money, to Caltrans or whomever when they had a project ready to go. And we weren't going to go to market maybe for 6-8 months, but they were ready with the shovels, and we'd said, here's the money, go to work, and then we'll sell the bonds later. Well, that collapsed last fall, and we had to use the money that was in the account to just pay the bills of the state. This is pre-IOU bill payment. And so about 5,000 jobs got shut down that were roads and so on. We all heard about those in our respective districts. So the first category is repaying loans that were drawn down from that account. But then you'll see transportation and the others, levies, et cetera, that were the recipients of the funds. Some have asked particularly where the money has gone, what do we still have to do? What's unfinished work with the current stream of projects? And it shows you now the authorized but unissued bonds and how they potentially could be used. Transportation being the largest single category of those that are yet to be sold. And there is a list that Caltrans and Water Resources and so on have of not just these projects where they're in the pipeline and they want to finish them, but new projects. There's quite an appetite for new projects, but truth is I haven't figured out how we're going to pay for them. The voters authorized tens of billions of new bonds in 2006, and the next list shows you what was approved, what's been issued, and what is still authorized but not yet out the door, and so you can make your judgments about how those are going. And some would wish to accelerate that, but when you're in the market for $35 billion in 1 year, it's very hard to imagine being able to do more, frankly. And so that's the charts I wanted to provide for you. I want to mention just one other thing before getting to the master plan, and we'd had a chance to talk about this in terms of managing our debt. I had this quote, I don't know if we distributed it to members of the committee, but every weekend one of the financial commentators, Bob Brinker, is on ABC throughout the country. He's in 200 radio stations, millions of listeners, and every time, and it happens at least once a month, I'm a regular listener, and once a month or more, he's beaten up California on his program. I call and I send him emails and I try to do things to have him lighten up a little bit. It doesn't seem to do much work, although he did ask me to be on the program soon to defend us, and I will do that, especially after I see our next budget proposal, whether it's defensible and in what way. But anyhow, but this is sort of typical of the Bob Brinker, and it's unfair. And I acknowledge that it's unfair, but it doesn't recognize our political and demographic and institutional difficulties that we have in California. But, the reality is that California, in my mind, is without question the worst fiscally managed state in the United States. People who run the state of California are the most incompetent governing body in any state in the Union. And he goes on and on of that sort. Gets a little worse. And
it
my
gets
only
worse
point,
from there?
Yeah. A bunch of kindergarten children and so on. And so the point is not to sort of pile on, because I think they're unfair remarks, but to just say, I read that or hear it every day from investors, from the financial press, from the radio program or whatever. And this is the market into which I'm trying to sell bonds. And so in terms of debt management long term, the one most significant thing that we could benefit from is a reasonably balanced budget. And I know how hard that is. It's easy to say than to do. But it's been a dozen years since we had an old-fashioned balanced budget. And there have been internal borrowing and gimmicks and all the stuff that we're criticized for. And it really is affecting our credit rating, the cost of borrowing, the difficulties in selling our bonds, and so on. I think probably, it used to be institutional investors were the life insurance companies and others were the big purchasers of our bonds. We've done a big effort in the retail markets to get sort of ma and pa investors to buy, and very successfully have done that. But we're kind of running out of tricks, and I'm thinking shortly we're going to probably have to go international to sell California bonds, which I hope we can do. But I don't know what the market reception and costs will be for that sort of thing, whether there'll be a premium or whatever. But it is getting hard, and so there aren't, whether if efficiencies are possible, great. But you all know it's taxes and cuts is the balance that gets you to a balanced budget. But these structural deficits that we have been enduring just are really costing us a lot of money, and it's going to make it harder and harder. And then that doesn't include the impact on the general fund that you want to spend for other things, for ongoing, schools or whatever, healthcare, public safety, that list, which is sort of an agreed upon list, I think, by virtually everyone. So debt service is cannibalizing your program support because of that growing thing. I hope we can figure out long-term strategy, and you alluded to that, Madam Chair, that we need to think about this for the next 30 years or something and kind of plan. The need, Assemblyman, experts tell us we probably need to invest $300 to $400 billion in California infrastructure. It's not possible. And so the question is then, if you can't do that, then what can you do or should you do, and how do you prioritize among those various claims? And we don't do a very good job figuring that out, of how much, what are the needs, and how do they match with the realistic potential for funding. And I hope we can, Madam Chair, I was hoping you're going to be the author of this measure, but however you sort it out over here, to have a good discussion of long-term planning for our infrastructure needs. That's all I have to say. Thanks.
That's a lot. Thank you so much for that presentation. I think it's a good opening to the discussion. I did want to just mention the comment that you read, that California is the worst fiscally managed state in the United States. I hear that a lot too, not from professionals, but from constituents and people out in the community. And I'm just here to say that with everybody's help here, I think this is something that we can start to change, because debt service, from your comments and from other things, is the Pac-Man that is eating up our general fund at an ever-increasing rate. And the more we spend there, the less we can spend on programs like I mentioned, like Every Woman Counts. Yep. With Mr. Swanson and Mr. Silva's permission, I'll defer questions until Mr. Taylor has had his comments. I have a lot of questions that Mr. Lockyer raised, but we'll go on to you, Mr. Taylor, and then we will have our questions at the end.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and members. You should have a short handout that was passed around before the hearing, and I want to just briefly go through that. I think the Treasurer did a very nice job of summarizing our situation on debt. I just want to add a few comments that hopefully will give a little more context, perhaps, to what the legislature faces. And starting on page 1, how does the legislature affect debt service? And I think, first of all, over the long run, you have absolute total control over what ends up being your debt service cost. Actually, I shouldn't say absolute anymore. The one exception to that is that very recently we've had a lot of initiative bond measures. That was very rare prior to 2002. Since then, we've had over $13 billion in initiative bond measures that have been approved by the voters. So when all of those bonds are issued, you're talking about $1 billion in additional debt service on those initiative measures. But with that exception, you kind of control ultimately your long-run debt service numbers. Now on page 2, I think it's even more important that you realize that you still have a lot of control in the shorter term. And that's because most bond measures, most authorized bonds still have to be appropriated by the legislature. So you can affect the course of your debt service costs based on the projects that you choose to appropriate. The Treasurer's not going to sell bonds until they've got projects that are ready to go. Now, there are exceptions to this. K-12 is probably the largest one where we've typically given continuous appropriation to get those bond monies out to districts. But other than that, there are pieces of bond measures. There was a $2.7 billion piece of the water bond, for example, that was continuously appropriated. There are pieces of a resources bonds and other bonds that are continuously appropriated. But the vast majority of them have to be, the proceeds have to be appropriated by the legislature, and therefore you still maintain a lot of control on how you realize your debt service. Similarly, even though you've already authorized a lot of lease revenue bonds, that's something that if they're not being issued, you can revoke that authority. So the numbers that the Treasurer's shown you, and that I'm going to show you here in a second, assumes that all of the authorized bonds will be issued and will be sold, and therefore you'll incur debt service in subsequent years. But again, you do have some authority over reducing those numbers. So if you go to the page 3, this is kind of our main chart. We call this the volcano chart. It looks a little bit like the lava flowing out on the different levels. But I think this is a nice summary way to show how you have some control over your future debt service cost. The bottom amount is your base. That's the bonds that have already been sold, and you're going to bear those costs no matter what. So let's look at the 3 layers on top of that. And the biggest one is the second layer there, and those are authorized but not yet sold bonds. And what we've done is taken, I think, similar assumptions that the Treasurer has made regarding how the schedule of those sales of the bonds. Basically, we assume that they'll be sold over about 7 years, all $65 billion of authorized but yet unsold bonds. And you can see how that adds to your debt service. You want to take the vertical difference in the lines, and it's going to add over $4.5 billion that you're going to have to pay out within 3, 4, or 5 years. Now, again, you can affect the course of that. This is not a given. This is just based on the Department of Finance schedule of how we will sell off those authorized but as yet unsold bonds. Now, on top of that, the little stream is the water bond we put on there, since that's on the 2010 ballot. The Chair already mentioned what the ongoing debt service will be on that one, once all are sold, which will be a while. And then on the top, you rightly ask, well, are we ever going to sell any more bonds? And typically we do. So we took an assumption that the Treasurer made in his report of what if we just assume that we sell the average of what we sold in the past. I think it was 86 to 90, 8, I can't remember exact years, but it works out to be about $7 billion a year, $14 billion every 2 years. So that top, that white bar on top, assumes that we sell $7 billion a year kind of every year. It actually grows for inflation, the amount that we sell. You have total control over that on what you put on the ballot. You could sell more, you could sell less. It's just an assumption. But you can see how then that adds on cumulatively as you issue those additional bonds each year. So where we're at about 6.5% now, you can see under these assumptions, it can easily grow to over 9.5%, close to 10%. Now, the reason the Treasurer cited slightly different numbers, he got up, I think, as high as 11. We only talk about infrastructure bonds here. We don't include the local government loan. I think he also, in his report, included the assumption that we would pass the strategic plan, growth plan 2 of the governor's. We didn't include that. You can just add on top whatever you think your new authorizations are. We can run whatever scenario you'd like. And we have a little different interest assumptions and different things like that. And under either case, debt service skyrockets as a percentage of your budget. And I think it's helpful to me, at least in terms of thinking about debt service ratios, because it in effect implicitly controls for the level of your revenues. So under any scenario, almost, it's going to grow rapidly. And that's because of those 2006 bonds that were approved by the voters, in addition to a lot of school bonds that were approved in 2002 and 2004, but primarily because of that huge slug of bonds from 2006. Now, on the next page, I just wanted to briefly talk about, people ask, is there a dangerous level of debt service? Is there a right level of debt service? In our view, there's not any particular single level of debt service that's appropriate, that's dangerous, that's wrong, that's right. As the Treasurer noted, it will change dramatically with your revenues if you're driving off, as a percent of general fund revenues. But more importantly, it's going to vary based on where the state is in its cycle of infrastructure investment or disinvestment. And I think that the leaders of the legislature, the governor, have rightly stressed the importance of infrastructure. It's one of the most important things that you do. So it's not inappropriately at certain times for that ratio to go up. But then you have this trade-off that every $1 billion in bonds that you issue is going to cost you roughly $70 million in debt service. And Assemblyman Swanson very nicely summarized this additional kind of tension that one of the few counter-cyclical things that you can do in your budget is kind of capital outlay, investing right now, putting our construction workers back to work, and yet that's the trade-off. Now, I think there's sometimes people will talk about capital outlay versus program, and I guess I don't think of it that way. Capital outlay is a way that you help deliver your program. You can't have services to schools if you don't have school buildings. You can't have transportation is almost all capital outlay, so you can't deliver highway services without having capital outlay. So it is just a tension. There's no right or wrong answer here, and I think you've already nicely summarized the tension that you feel of the need to issue bonds to have these programs and fulfill our infrastructure needs, but the hit on the budget that it requires. And I don't think either the Treasurer or I have an answer exactly how you balance that out. Now, on page 5, we talk about, well, how can the legislature better control its debt service payments? We've had for several years, in fact, I brought the last copy in 2008, we have a 5-year infrastructure plan that the Department of Finance is required to provide. It lists the 5-year needs for every department. They list their financing proposals on how that should be financed, both with general obligation bonds, lease revenue bonds, other taxes, other non-state sources. Like the gas tax right now is used to pay for most of our transportation program. So it's not just a matter of general obligation bonds. You have a lot of possible ways of financing your infrastructure needs. But despite the information in this report, we really haven't done much with it. In my view, it's changed almost not at all the way we go about our planning process, our budgeting process, and I mean that both in the administration and in the legislature. And I think that's unfortunate. The Treasurer has proposed a master plan. Now, in part, we have a lot of that information available, but I think he rightly is trying to push things forward to we'll take information and do something with it. And towards that end, I would actually suggest even something more. I think the legislature, and this is something we've had on the table for several years, I think you should form a joint legislative Committee on Infrastructure. And on the next page, I outline some of the things that it could actually do, decisions that it could make that, in my view, need to be made. For example, that joint committee could take either the information in the annual finance plan, it could take a master plan commission if they put out a report, and it could assess that. But I think it could do much more. I think there are some basic decisions that the legislature needs to make when it thinks about its capital outlay needs. That is, in some ways, maybe we're now financing things that we shouldn't be financing. If you think about parks, we've had a lot of our bond measures that have paid for local parks. Is that appropriate, or should that be done at the local level? Should the state reserve its park funds for parks of statewide interest or of a larger regional interest? The community colleges. Currently, there is no sharing ratio that the state imposes on community colleges when they get state bond funds. We have a roughly 50% match for K-12 districts. What is the appropriate sharing ratio with community college districts? I think that should be a legislative decision, something you make, and a joint committee could help you in grappling with those kind of issues. In addition, I think that a joint committee could evaluate how you maximize the use of non-general fund revenues. That is, infrastructure is not financed just with general funds supported general obligation bonds. And you have a lot of things available. I mentioned transportation, where we use the gas tax on a more of a pay-as-you-go basis. You considered it in your water deliberations. You have UC research. We spend a lot of money on UC research. They have their own funding source for that. They get a lot of federal money that could be used, in our view, much more extensively to pay for those kind of facilities. You've talked about P3, private-public partnerships. And in some cases, I think that is an appropriate source to consider. So you have a lot of ways to finance your infrastructure. And I think your concern, Madam Chair, as well, what's it doing to the general fund? In some ways, in some cases, we can have our cake and eat it too if we wisely use other types of sources. And then finally, I think that joint committee could look at ways that we can maximize the use of our existing facilities. And one area that my office has pushed for a long time is year-round education and higher education. We don't use many of our facilities at all during the summer, and there's enormous capacity in our higher ed facilities at all three of our segments to do that. And there's a lot of other cases where we need to rethink how the state provides services. You know, in recent years, we've shifted a lot of the juvenile justice responsibilities down to locals. So maybe that fits a little bit better in the state-local responsibilities. But our facilities at the state level and housing juveniles has gone down dramatically. We don't spend a lot on capital outlay for those because it's being handled at the local level. So there's programmatic decisions, too, that need to be made at the state level in deciding how much is a state responsibility as a local, how we can better use facilities, how we can finance them. So I would strongly urge you to consider a decision-making entity. And again, I think master plan, using this plan is an important first step, but you've got to do something with it. We don't want to just be planning and getting information. You have to have a decision-making entity. And this is just one option that we've put forward as a way that we think could help the legislature in better allocating, assigning, determining what its priorities are and what it wants to fund. And with that, I join the treasurer in welcoming any questions or comments.
Thank you. I think both of you have done an excellent job in presenting this material in a way that is understandable to me, at least, and I hope as well as to others, because it's extremely complex and it's very broad. And just to comment on your last point, Mr. Taylor, my frustration in a very strictly term-limited environment is we don't have the opportunity as a legislature to make decisions that will go forward. At the very most, we have the opportunity to make a consensus that potentially will hold for 2 years, tops. There's just no way to do it any other way. And the idea of having a master plan that is adopted at some point by the legislature, hopefully committed to by the governor, and, you know, for at least some period of time can then be moved forward. But we can't just keep continually trying to reinvent this every 2 years. It doesn't work, and it doesn't allow us to go forward at all. I just want to raise a couple of issues, and then I'll let the other members have some questions. Mr. Lockyer, in your report, the investments we need for the future we want, California needs a master plan. On page 3 of your executive summary, you lay out 2 recommendations that I'm very, very interested in. one being the Master Plan for Infrastructure Financing and Development. And I wonder if you could flesh that out a little more, your thoughts about the mechanism for creating that. And then the second recommendation, which I'm also very interested in, is the legislature and the governor should begin to craft a thoughtful and effective response to projected growing deficits. And it's one of my missions in life to try to lay out some idea about how California might come back to fiscal health, including a balanced budget, which is the largest component of that. But this really seems to get, I think, to the heart of that matter. So if you could address a little bit more in detail those 2 points.
Well, I think Mac made what's the most important point with respect to long-term planning, which is if it's simply some study that's on the shelf and not put to work, it's sort of a misuse of staff time. But if it's something that actually gets written into statute and there's some discipline about observing it, then I think it's a good tool, particularly when we're in a era of shortages where the need and demand is going to be a lot longer than the ability to finance all the projects that are wished for. So, and it's really the legislature to decide the composition of the commission. Our initial thought is the governor and the legislature both appoint people to it and have some members, but public people and department people, but external people as well, sort of like Little Hoover, that plays a more active role in management assessments and long-term planning. And that's as far as we've gotten with it. We're happy to work more on it with yourselves and others that are interested, Madam Chair. With respect to long-term structural deficits, we see the ones in sort of current accounts. I serve on PERS and STRS, and it's really alarming, the health account deficits long-term for retired state and local government employees. And we need Mr. Taylor's office and us and others regularly suggest that we need to start making very substantial prepayment commitments to pay for those long-term health care needs. And of course, it's easy to say, and it's very hard to do when there's going to be a very immediate shorting of some program that people think is important to. But again, not just balancing the current $20 billion in the next 18 months or whatever that number is. I think it's probably larger than that. But those sorts of year-to-year budget balancing, but long-term structural changes, and there's no magic here. You know what they are, and they're hard. But people have somehow got to figure out in a bipartisan way how to address that. And the federal budget, we hear the concern about federal budget deficits regularly. Well, their debt service is about 10% of the federal budget, federal revenues. And we're talking about the same sort of situation at the state level. Various debt management reports, I've had suggestions, a whole menu of potential tax increases if someone wanted to look for new revenues, and various kinds of changes in sentencing policy or other things that are the cost drivers in some of the programs. But all we can do is sort of lay them out there and see if the political will exists. Mostly it doesn't.
Well, I think we're getting into some difficult terrain if we don't take a bipartisan hard look at this, and all of us set aside our sacred cows, so to speak. One other issue I just wanted you to elaborate a little bit more on. You talked about our credit rating being BBB and how much more that is costing us. And I know that credit markets set their own ratings, and I'm wondering, I always grapple with this question, what's it due to? Is it due to something California is doing or isn't doing? Is it due to the fact that the credit markets know that California is going to be good for it, so why not charge us more? And if so, what can we do about that? How much of this is due to things that are outside of our control?
Yeah. Well, when you go through the commentaries of the credit rating agencies, and there's a handful of those, but they essentially agree on how to rank our credit. What you find is some things are that they talk about are, the 2/3 requirement to adopt a budget and the initiative process and things that were not likely to change or certainly not going to be changed different tomorrow. But they do talk about things like that. But then they also talk about the structural deficit and how substantial it is and growing, and that there doesn't seem to be an ability to just turn the trend around and at least see some progress in eventually getting rid of the bulk of the structural deficit. So they talk about that and debt levels. Some of our, but I think it's largely been a reflection of state finances. Now, the credit rating agencies don't particularly make money from giving us a bad grade. They're very cozy with big investors, I should say. So, to what extent they reflect their desire to have a better return on their investments, maybe there's some sort of subconscious connection or whatever, just being in the same world and knowing each other. But by and large, they don't make money by giving us good or bad grades. I think they have methodological flaws in their systems. The House passed Barney Frank's measure, or the financial services measure, does include some provisions to try to get a better credit ratings methodology established, because when AAA corporate debt is more likely to default than B municipal debt, the grades don't make sense. And so we're hoping at some point that'll get rationalized and the investors will get better information and it'll be fair to our taxpayers. But we're not there yet. I think those are the principal factors, really, and then some sense of the economic environment in the state and what does that mean for revenue stream and things of that sort that they forecast as well. As you know, forecasters were created to make astrologers look good. And so it's more art than science, perhaps, but everybody tries, and we can do it short term better than long term. But that's what they're doing too.
And then one question of clarification for either or both of you. When you look at the percentage of our general fund budget that you attribute to debt going forward, you made the point, Mr. Lockyer, that the percentage obviously depends upon the revenues in any given year.
Yeah.
So what revenue assumptions are you making in these charts that you showed us?
What
Just
revenues?
generally.
We have numbers, but
Well, just kind of generally. Are you assuming that revenues are going to be the same as they are
share
this year?
them. They're essentially the same revenue forecasts that we all use,
Okay.
which are principally Department of Finance. But
Okay.
would you add anything to that?
These
Yeah,
are
I mean,
based on-
it's basically a slow recovery and then just some kind of trend line in the out years.
So the obvious question is, if our revenues were to go up, the percentage of debt of our general fund would correspondingly go down.
Yes.
So you said, I think, if we had a cascade of new revenues, that we would look better.
But no one expects that from this current recovery, if that's what we call it. Maybe unemployment drifts down. The Fed's numbers are 1% a year, each year for the next 3 years. And if you look at the various projections, the amount of household debt that's increased, and so not just on the employment side, but other debt that people are struggling with, it's ballooned in the last 5 or 6 years rather substantially, and so there are reasons to home foreclosures, et cetera, to worry about how an economy that's 70% consumer driven is going to recover in some robust way.
Okay, Mr. Swanson, and then Mr. Silva.
So I yield to Mr. Silver first. Okay, okay. Sure. Yeah. First of all, thank you both for your presentations. I appreciate it very much, and it's very sobering. I wanted to. It's clear that California is losing money and spending more money by the way we're organized, or the way we have organized our finances. You know, the radio commentator makes his point his way, but the fact of the matter is that, you know, because the state of California, its bond rating is the lowest of, you know,
50.
yeah, that it's clear that we're doing something wrong. And I think that's very difficult to argue, that point. So a couple of points. How would both of you feel about, one, the suggestion that California make it mandatory that revenue streams are tied to the initiative bonds that are passed? Do you have any thought about that?
My view is that it's a good idea to, if people are going to spend money by initiative, the initiators ought to explain to voters where the money's coming from. So I think that's a good reform, and I believe there are bills kicking around here that try to do that. I hope that happens. Mm-hmm. Do you have a view?
Well, my only concern, I think there's a lot of benefits to that. My only concern is it tends to lock things away. Because when you say tie a revenue stream to a program, then regardless of what the priorities of that program are in the future, you're locked into spending on it. I think the governor's after-school program is a good example. Is spending $500 million for after-school childcare, which may be very valuable. Is that our highest priority given what our schools have gone through? So I am concerned about the lock-in effect of those proposals, Assemblyman.
Mm-hmm. Now
I share that concern. Maybe in an ideal world, it would be pay for it and it would be flexible money, but
or you revisit it after 7 years or something like that.
But we've heard the treasurer said to us on several occasions that the balanced budget, the state balanced budget, obviously is an environment that we can that will improve our bond rating if, in fact, we are able to pass a budget on time and balance the budget. And so, obviously, it's all extremely connected to how we conduct our business, and it costs the taxpayers of California more money in the long run, paying these higher costs. And so, it's incumbent upon us to figure out how we, in fact, do balance our budget. And the debt service, as it was reported today, it seems like it's going to outpace what we spend on higher education, which is tragic. That's the projection. But also debt service, it seems, it's also clear infrastructure. The infrastructure need, it's also clear that it's something that we have to pay for now or we pay for later, and many times later it costs more money. And so it seems that that we have to have a discussion with the public to explain that there are some things in our state that we're going to have to pay for, and infrastructure is one of those things. And I would hope that and I think what we're doing to education in the state is just horrible. I think you have to be brain dead not to see the value of investing in education, and we don't. And I just you know, and the fact that we are not helping to develop that sort of intellectual talent and property in this state is a horrible tragedy. And the question of that you raise about taxes, we avoid that question, and we shouldn't avoid it because there's no way to avoid the cost. 32% increase in student tuitions is a tax. Mm-hmm. If we cut $800 million out of the budget and our educational system has to increase the fees, then we're responsible for that. And that is an increase to the citizens in the state of California. So the choice has to become us organizing it better. So I hope that we're facing now, the LAO has indicated, we're facing a $20.6 billion projected shortfall. And I don't see how, and that is associated with, that is connected with the bonds. If we don't come up with a balanced budget for that this spring, then it will affect the bonds. And I guess, Mr. Treasurer, is it about 18,000 jobs associated with
Yes.
every $1 billion invested?
Yeah, that's the rule of thumb we use, about 18,000 jobs for every $1 billion of bond money that gets spent. And so with the respect to the bonds we've sold this year and their impact, it's about 268,000 jobs, largely in the building trades, that have been financed and maintained by those bond infrastructure investments.
Yeah, and
a lot of jobs.
And the chair has indicated that she's hopeful that there's some bipartisan solution. Well, it seems to me around the bonds, maybe there is the working of that, because the jobs that are created, in addition to the small businesses in California that are helped by the infrastructure activity, it seems to me that and we're in the middle of a recession. Maybe we can fashion a bipartisan solution that would look at some way to get us balanced, pay for some of the debt services. In other words, dedicated, go to the people of California and explain that we do need a revenue stream, as the Treasurer indicated earlier in the comments, that would assure investors that California was good for it, and we get better rates as a result of that. And if this is then dedicated to debt service, this revenue stream, then we will be able to invest. Our bonds will flow. Those bonds then will help create jobs and stimulate business activity in the state as we work on the balanced budget. Would the LAO also agree that the balanced budget is essential to an environment for us to try to get a handle on lower costs in our bond issue?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's overwhelmingly the factor that leads to our rating. I don't think it's the amount of bonds. I think it's just our situation. And investors want to be assured over the long run that the money's going to be there. Now, one thing that just makes this decision even harder for you right now is that we are getting such great bids on our contracts, many coming in 20, 30% below. So dollars spent now are really going far. And so it just makes your decisions that much more difficult.
If I might add two things. One is the state, unlike Orange County or Vallejo, the state can't go bankrupt legally. We can have these deficits and problems and so on, but it may look like it, but it isn't legally that in terms of trying to discharge debt or abridge contracts or whatever. But and related, I think there's absolutely no possibility of defaulting on our debt, on our bonds. It's such a high priority of payment that there'll always be enough revenue coming in, even in bad years like this, to pay the debt service. It's really a question of how much of the general fund does the debt service gobble up, and the things we've talked about earlier. If I may also, Sandra, this thought I'd like to maybe leave you with is half a century ago, different countries thought about their long-term future prospects. And to take three, Jamaica, Nigeria, Singapore, they all had roughly the same per capita income 50 years ago, about $2,300 per cap. Jamaica said our future is tourism. Nigeria said it's resource development, especially oil. Singapore said knowledge-based jobs. Today, Nigeria and Jamaica's per capita income is roughly the same, $5,500 a year. Singapore is $42,000. Knowledge-based job investment pays off. for everybody. And so it just reinforces the point you made, and I, with some, as an economist, sees it basically, the smartness of
Let me conclude this way. As my colleagues, I am also a native Californian, born proudly in Oakland, California, in Highland Hospital, county baby. Shout out to all the county babies.
East Oakland Hospital.
That's right. That's right. And it used to be a time in California when people moved to our state because we had one of the best education systems in the country. And so the question becomes, when are we going to get to the point where we have to say to the people of California that we must invest in our state as a result of this? And then, as legislators, we have a responsibility to make sure our infrastructure is not collapsing around our people, and so it doesn't become a danger to our citizens. That must be paid for also. And I think that you've said it all when you said that it's going to require us to show some courage and make some decisions and offer some solutions. I think this question of revenue, what we should be paying fees for, it should be completely examined. We're one of the few states that charge fewer fees for services that many states, like New York, will have people pay fees for. But we have to examine that question, but we have to also invest in our state. And I think the only way to get to that is a sobering conversation about how we pay for that. And I think that we as legislators have to show the courage to make sure that we're willing to go to the people of the state and be honest about what it's going to cost us to have this kind of state we want, and then pay for our priorities.
Thank you, Mr. Swanson. Excellent comments and questions. Mr. Silva?
Thank you. Madam Chair, it seems like California has worked themselves into a corner. We worked ourselves into a corner. And I know that term limits were set up several years ago. I was opposed to them at that time, and I still am, because it seems like when we work on a budget, we have people that have been in for less than 4 or 5 years. There's no institutional memory here. And I think that we've made mistakes that have been made before, but we don't have the members that are saying, you know, if you do this, this is going to happen. So we're out there making the same mistakes. I look at the money that we spent on a recall recently for our governor. I was against that one. Now they're talking about a part-time legislature. And if they're concerned about the legislators not being accountable enough, well, it's going to be even less so. I mean, somewhere common sense has to prevail. We passed bonds in this state with a simple majority. But if we need revenue, Mr. Swanson, to pay for that, it takes 2/3.
Yeah.
Well, one guy's buying the car expecting the other guy to pay for it, and it is not working out. Unemployment, we're looking at 10%, and I spent time in Nevada with some of my colleagues, and we were interviewing businesses in Nevada that had left California, and the governor of Nevada sponsored it, and my question was, why would he want to sponsor it so we can find out why people are leaving California? But he wanted to gear his ad program for that, and they are hitting us in the state of California right now. Move to Nevada with your business. In talking to a lot of these businesses, they said no one from the state contacted them when they were leaving the state of California. And I've talked to the governor about this, and something has to be done. We have to work with these businesses, find out why they are leaving California, get in there and work with them and talk them into staying, because when a business leaves, they take the jobs, but they leave their employees here unemployed. And we can't continue down this road. And when we're talking about the budget, Mr. Taylor and Mr. Lockyer, we've been talking about the expense side. Well, we have to look at that revenue side, and what do we have to do to bring jobs back to California? A couple months ago, I had a chance to visit Palm Springs. I don't know if you guys have been there lately, but driving down the middle of Palm Springs, half the businesses are closed. And I look at every shop that's closed as at least one, maybe two families that no longer have an income. And it is heartbreaking. And I know that that the state legislature has inherited a recession. It's worldwide. But I do feel that we're going to have to work together to solve these problems. And I feel sorry for the people that, like, we have jobs up here, and we're all born in California. But there are a lot of people that are residents of California that weren't born here and don't have a job, and I think we've got to make sure that we can cover the bases. And I look at education. To me, education is our future. If we don't educate our young people, California is not going to have a very bright future. Looking at the budget, I remember when I first was elected in 06, Liz Hill projected that revenue was going to be going down in the year 07, 08. But yet, when we worked on the budget, it didn't seem like we paid any attention to what she was talking about. So then, 3 months after we signed the budget, we're back trying to balance a budget that we knew was out of balance when we passed it. I've seen committees take low bid elements out of contracts because, and the question that comes up, well, why are you taking the low bid out? Well, the voters of California didn't vote those bonds in for infrastructure. They voted those bonds in to provide jobs. Well, I think they did it for two reasons. And we have to get, in California, we have to make every dollar count. And I don't see that. But I do feel that we have people in the state legislature that are willing to work together. We're all in this thing together, and we've got to figure out how we can keep jobs in California, to build that revenue up, service that debt that we've got. And unlike the federal government, we can't print money. Thank you, Lord.
But we can print bonds. Thank you, Mr. Silva. Very well said. Mr. Lockyer, Mr. Taylor, any closing comments?
No. Thank you.
And I just want to mention, Mr. Silva kind of alluded to the fact that in this term-limited environment, the legislature can't really learn from its past mistakes. And so that's why I really appreciate the expertise of you, in particular, Mr. Lockyer. You've served in the legislature. You've been here many years. You've served in many different capacities. And I tend to encounter people like you in airports and other places and grab people by the lapels and say, what do we do, what do we do? And I don't often get very good answers because really nobody has a magic bullet and nobody has a good answer that's a simple one. And so I appreciate both of your gentlemen's reports and your comments today and your assistance and advice and counsel as we try to grapple with this moving forward during what's going to be a very, very difficult year. And this is the first, at least in my intention, the first of many discussions on this particular topic, trying to figure out how to get a handle on this debt. Yes, Mr. Lockyer?
With especially budget committee members, I think to the extent that you get bipartisan work actually going and looking at programs and talking to people that are in mid-management or lower, you know, if you talk to budget directors or directors, they just tell you they need more money, and so, you know, you knew that before you went. But you learn a lot about what's going on at EDD or whatever the resources or wherever. If you actually go and experience it and look at what's going on and talk to people, I think that might be, because the answer to these problems essentially in a legislative setting are about your relationships with each other. And they're fragile and complicated and necessary to getting consensus on matters. And I think maybe that experience helps build relationships and knowledge that can help address these long-term needs. That's as best as I can do, and I know it's sort of an abstraction, but I think that's what's needed next.
Well, that's something that I think all of my colleagues do on the local level. And when I take tours of different facilities, particularly low-income health clinics in rural areas, first question I ask is, what's your funding source? And there's an array of them usually. But the thing they always say is, well, we need more money from the state. And we'd all like to say, well, here's your check, but it's not possible. But I don't think that's something we necessarily do here in the Capitol. And that is something that I think is well advised because, again, in term limits where we've got 2 years to 6 years here on the average, those relationships don't happen. And we know in the legislature, our Republican colleague has left, but it's difficult to develop those relationships across party lines, let alone outside of the Capitol. But that's very good advice. Any other closing comments? Thank you. Oh, Mr. Swanson.
I just wanted to thank both of you gentlemen, and just also suggest, since we're heading toward another budget crisis, that it was very effective when you appeared before the entire legislative body and made a presentation. Those are very helpful, by the way, and so I encourage you to be strategic and to come before us again and help us find some creative solutions.
I'm sure this will not be the last time. Thank you, everybody. Just a matter of housekeeping, I want to mention we have written comments from Assemblymember Diane Harkey, who was unable to be here today, and those will be entered into the record of today's hearing. Thank you to the staff that organized this hearing and put everything together, and thank you, everyone, for your participation. We're adjourned.